Well, let me ask you a question. Wouldn't it be great if in our life of faith nothing ever went awry? Wouldn't it be great if we were to live our lives in an endless line of spiritual high points and there was never any low points, we never felt far removed from God, that in almost tangible manners we could continually feel the closeness of God, and this always would increase our happiness and our joy and our bliss forever? Wouldn't that be grand? Wouldn't it be great for Braden, baptized today? Wouldn't it be great for him that from the moment of baptism until his dying day and beyond, that his spiritual life was just chock-a-block full of intense moments of spiritual satisfaction and divine harmony? That would be awesome, wouldn't it? I hate to break the news to you, but it doesn't happen. Yes, our spiritual lives are lived with high points, and yes, there are points through Jesus where the love of God just comes so close. But there are also moments in which we wrestle with God. Our reading from Genesis contains that very thing. It's a story of Jacob literally wrestling with God for an entire evening. And this is an important part of Jacob's life. Jacob, which means deceiver and plotter, he gets a new name which means Israel, because he has strived with God, he has struggled with God, and he's won. A contemporary translation says, "You will be called Israel because you have slugged it out with God." Sometimes in our lives, sometimes we feel that we just slug it out with God. And I think that's an important truth about our Christian lives. It may seem odd, when I was thinking about this, that we've had a baptism of joy and wonder, and yet I'm preaching a sermon on wrestling with God. Surely that could have been another Sunday. But it's an important part of our spiritual lives. And it's one that I think we need to come to grips with and understand. And it's something that in his life of faith, in Brain's life of faith, he's going to experience. And I think we need to know what it means. As I said, by reading the story of Jacob wrestling with God, I think we learn important truths about our own life of faith. And it occurs primarily in three ways. Firstly, it shows us the reality of our own wrestling. Wrestling with God occurs. It happens. Now, it could be because of confusion, we're trying to figure something out. Could be because of fear. Could be because we are questioning where God is in our life or in the life of somebody else. Maybe we are angry. Maybe we're hurt. Maybe we're in a place where we need to feel that we just got to give God a piece of our mind. But whatever the reason, there are times in our lives in our life of faith, where we wrestle. Because faith, Christian faith, is not an eternal happy pill. It doesn't mean that everything occurs exactly as we would like, when we would like, how we would like. It's not what faith is. Jacob is wrestling with God because he's about to meet his brother for the very first time. His first time since having to run for his life because his brother wanted to kill him after he stole the family inheritance. And Jacob tried to plot and get all this kind of stuff for him, and his life isn't turning out as he would hoped. And now he's thinking he's meeting his brother who's going to try to kill me, and he's afraid. Just before our reading, the story of Jacob wrestling, Jacob prays to God and says, "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness, O God, that you have shown me." Then he prays, "Save me from the hand of my brother." Jacob isn't praying for a result, but he's praying for a sense of confirmation of God's promise, of God's presence with him. And so now, on the eve before he will meet his brother again, he stands alone with nothing to bargain, with nothing to barter with, He stands alone before God. And that's important for Jacob, because Jacob has spent his entire life trying to amass things, trying to see the blessing of God in terms of family and possessions and cattle, and trying to get as much as he could, which is why he stole his brother's inheritance. But now he stands completely alone. He sends all his stuff ahead of him. He stands alone before God. Because here's the thing. Sometimes we think that wrestling means that we are alone. It means that God is abandoned and God is away. Here's the thing about wrestling. Wrestling with God is actually a form of intimacy. If you think about wrestling matches on television, you cannot wrestle with an opponent if you are the only person in the ring. The person is there with you. In wrestling, the two people are intertwined with each other. They're almost as close as they can be. Jacob later says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Jacob is holding on to God for dear life. He names the place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face." In wrestling with God, there is a deep connection. There is a profound intimacy. Wrestling isn't about abandonment. Because how can you wrestle with one who's not there? Billy Graham, in his book, Just As I Am, he talks about this point of wrestling in his life. And he writes that I have never felt so alone or so close to God. When you wrestle, if you are wrestling today, as Braden grows up, hold before him this truth, that wrestling with God is a form of closeness, even though he may never feel it, even though you may feel in that point of wrestling that God is against you or God is pushing back. The fact is, you are feeling the presence of God. And when you read through Scripture, everybody goes through this. All the high saints of Scripture, Jesus goes through this. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he throws himself down, he sweats drops of blood, and he prays, "O Lord, if you can make this cup pass from me, please do so. Not my will, but yours be done." He's wrestling. Wrestling with God is a point of our lives. It happens. This probably has occurred in our life. This may be occurring now. And you know what? It will probably occur again. But this form of closeness where God comes very near, let's be honest, it can hurt a bit. Tell Braden as he grows up that faith isn't always easy. It doesn't always produce blissful happiness. Wrestling with God can be uncomfortable. It can be prolonged. Verse 25 says that when the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of his hip. And verse 31, when he's leaving Peniel, he says he was limping because of the hip. And it doesn't say why this occurred. It doesn't say that he, put the hip out of socket in order to teach Jacob a little humility, or because he was going to teach him a sense of God's strength beyond his own weakness. We don't know why this happened. In the New Testament, Paul talks about a thorn in his flesh and says that through it he learned about God's grace that is always sufficient. We may not know why kind of that stuff happens. But that doesn't take away from the fact that for Jacob, having his hip wrenched out of socket, it hurt. And while in our wrestling, we may be able to look back and say, well, this reminds me of God's grace, or this reminds me of God's love, or God's strength in a time of my weakness, wrestling hurts. Wrestling can hurt. Wrestling with God can be uncomfortable, and it can take a while. Whether it's for a month, or for an entire season, or whether it's just for an evening, or just for a moment, wrestling with God is always longer than we would like. However, God initiates that wrestling for the purpose of making some inner transformation in us, to affect our lives and to draw us deeper in knowledge of God's will and God's purpose for us. If you thought about, the way it talks about Jacob wrestling, the man, which is God's presence in kind of human form, it just shows up.